Hello and welcome to the Diverse Bookshelf with me, Samia Aziz. On this show, I interview incredible authors doing a deep dive into important themes and issues while talking all things books. On today's episode, I'm talking to Nigar Alam about her stunning debut novel, Under the Tamarind Tree, which I absolutely loved. So this is going to be a conversation all about Pakistan, about class, about the partition, about friendship, moving around, refugees, and so much more. Nigar Alam was born in Karachi, Pakistan, and spent her childhood in Turkey, Nigeria, Italy, Kenya, Indonesia, and the United States. She currently lives in Minnesota. Under the Tamarind Tree is her debut novel, and it's set in the seaside city of Karachi in Pakistan. The main character, a woman named Rozeena, opens the novel sitting on her veranda near a garden shaded by palm and Ashoka trees. She receives a call from someone she knew in the past. And this starts off a whole spiral of events and the unleashing of secrets and hidden truths. The rest of the book fluctuates between a dual timeline and follows Rozeena and her friends in the decades after the partition of India and Pakistan in 1947. I'm so glad that Nigar is my guest today. Hi, Nigar. Welcome to the Diverse Bookshelf podcast. Thank you so much for joining me today. I cannot wait to speak to you and talk about your stunning debut novel and just find out a lot more about you and your writing journey. But how are you doing today?
I am great. I'm so excited to be here. Thank you for having me. I'm a fan of your podcast, and I feel it was much needed in this
Oh,
environment. Yes.
thank you. Thanks so
Yeah.
much. That means a lot, honestly, it really does. So, you are a published author, and your debut book is this really beautiful, gently told, multi layered, dual timeline novel called Under the Tamarind Tree. And it's a really stunning cover, just lots of color and lots of shades and shapes and lots of stuff going on. But the novel itself, as I've already suggested, I absolutely loved it. I think it's a much needed story and really beautifully captured. But before we get into the intricacies of the novel, I want to talk a little bit about yourself and your writing journey. So I know that growing up, you moved around a lot. I believe you lived in 7 countries across 4 continents before you were 18. That's a lot of moving around for any person, but I think especially for a child. So, what were some of the things that, especially I guess now with hindsight, what are some of the things that you learned from traveling around so much?
Oh, that is a great question because I always have a tough time when people ask me, so where did you grow up? Then I have to start listing countries, and I feel that's so boring. But when I was doing it, when I was moving around with my family, I didn't think it was that different because that was my normal. I always say that if your childhood was good, then you've won. It really
Yeah.
doesn't matter where you were, how often you had to pack and move. So, in that way, I was very blessed because it was a good childhood. And the older I get, the more I realize that is rare. That is really rare. And so, if it was, I was very fortunate. One thing, though, it did teach me in hindsight, especially when I wanted to write in long form rather than flash fiction, was that I wanted a story that is a human story and relatable across cultures and languages and geographical locations. Because moving around, I just knew, I just learned it, I think I absorbed it as a child that we are all the same. I lived on 4 different continents. What could be more different than that? And
Mm.
yet, the kids were the same. The playground activities were the same. The tears were the same, the laughter, the joy, what we wanted, our dreams, our fears. So human beings at the core are really the same. You just have to scratch the surface and you can see that. So I did want to present a story that is not that single story that you get from Pakistan,
Mm.
which these days is always an unfortunate story with that awful label. And I wanted it to be a story that human beings on the other side of the world could connect to and say, hey, we're actually more alike than we are different. And that's, I think, what I learned growing up, apart from the actual book learning that one does in school. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really that's very beautiful. And your characters in your book move around as well. We've got families that are displaced due to partition, and then we've got characters that move abroad for study or to go and live somewhere else and then moving house and all of that sort of thing. And I think what you capture so well in your book is the impact that movement and migration and forced migration has on relationships and has on friendships. And I wonder, because I think like moving around is very hectic on a practical level, like having to adjust to a new place and pack up all your belongings. And sometimes, depending on how often a person travels, like your belongings then shrink to something that you can easily move around, and because you're thinking like, oh, I may have to move in 2 months or 3 months. But there's a real emotional toll as well in having to leave behind a place that you have memories, leave behind friendships. And especially, I think, a few decades ago when we didn't have such ease of communication like WhatsApp and FaceTime and all of these things. And also, then I think, especially as a child, like leaving behind your friends, not knowing if you're going to see them again, and then having to go to a new place, adjust to a new place, but also make new friends. And that human connection element of it, I'm really interested in what your experiences may have taught you about relationships and what happens when we have to leave places.
Yes, that is absolutely true. It was quite an experience trying to maintain those human connections. I think each child has a personality and responds differently to the situation. Even children in one family with the same parents can react completely differently to all of this moving and displacement, if you want to call it. I was lucky in that I always managed to make friends. That is very lucky because it's not easy for everyone. But then I knew that in a couple of years, maybe 2 years, I would move or they would move, right? So I continuously lost friends.
Mm.
And yes, in those olden days when I was growing up, there was no email or any easy way to maintain that contact. And at 8 or 9, you're not going to be writing letters to each other.
Yeah.
So I did continuously lose friends. And I think that led me to be fascinated by childhood friends. That idea that you could grow up just knowing the same handful of people and you know them inside out because you've experienced everything together.
Mm.
And in my book, those four childhood friends are my desire to examine what can happen and how well you can know each other and how that friendship can evolve. I've said this in a couple of talks here in the US, and afterwards, some people come up to me and say, we grew up in one town all our lives and we could not wait to leave. So I think it's what you don't have is what's more interesting. We always wonder about what we don't have because there are pros and cons in every situation. I have very few belongings, actually. That is something I never thought of. Maybe that's where it comes from. I don't have a desire to collect stuff. I
Mm.
just don't. I'm always giving. I have this rule that if I haven't used something in 1 year, I give it away because I feel, what am I saving it for?
Mm.
So maybe that's where it comes from. I should analyze that belief of mine.
That is very interesting because I was thinking that just before we started to speak, I up until the age of 25, I lived in the same house. Like my parents moved from literally a 5 minute walk away. They moved from a home to where I grew up. And so I was like 11 months old when my family moved into this home. My parents still live there to this day with my brother and his family. So my nieces and nephews are growing up in that house as
Oh
well.
my
But I
goodness.
lived there for 25 years. I did I went to university in another city, so I was away for a little bit of that time, but university is like in chunks of time. I wasn't
Yeah,
away for 3 years continuously. So up until the age of 25, I lived in I lived in one house,
that's
which
remarkable.
no, I know. And I had friends that moved, especially I guess like when we went to secondary school, like people moved to different areas,
Mm,
usually still within the same city. And so my friendships did change for sure.
mm,
But then so for the last 8 years, I have moved 3 times or 4 times, which to me, for somebody that hadn't moved for 25 years, to move 4 times in 8 years feels like a
oh,
lot.
that is a lot. That's definitely a lot. Objectively speaking, that's a lot. Yes. And how did you cope with that?
I think because I didn't, like you said, because I didn't have it, I didn't have the experience of moving around so much. I was really interested in what it was going
Okay.
to be like.
Yeah.
I was very excited about the thought of living somewhere new and learning so much and meeting new people. But I think actually, unfortunately for me, I got quite anxious quite early on. I realized that, oh, this is a very different life, like the life of
Mm,
somebody that keeps moving. Especially, I think, if you go to somewhere where you don't know people or you don't know many people, which is what happened to me. And I think that when you've been somewhere where you know every single corner and people living on most of the streets in your local area,
mm,
it's a very different experience.
yeah.
But I think as well, because I moved in adulthood, so I think I was a lot more resilient as an adult than I was as a child in many ways. But kids are very resilient also.
I think one thing that, sorry, I think one thing that definitely helped was being grounded and anchored for me in
Mm,
Karachi. Was our entire summers would be spent in Karachi in this one house,
mm,
my grandmother's house, and it would house other cousins from other countries also. That definitely gave me a sense of place and a sense of home because you're right. You don't know people when you move continuously. Nothing is familiar, not even the language, and definitely not your room or anything or your
mm,
school. So those summers were like a big warm embrace. It's like, this is where you are, and you'll
mm.
always have a home here, and this is where you can always say you are from.
It's really, yeah, that's really nice. I can imagine that's very, very comforting. Yeah, because I think like when I've moved, I've always felt like, but I have an idea of where home is, and home is still that house that I lived in for 25 years, and I think it will always be home,
Mm.
even though I'm very comfortable where I'm living right now, and very happy. I still think that is always going to be home. But let's start to talk about your book. So, could you
Yeah.
take a moment to introduce Under the Tamarind Tree? Tell our listeners what your novel is about.
Yes, thank you. So, Under the Tamarind Tree is set in Karachi, Pakistan, and it alternates between the present day time and 1964. So, it's told in two timelines. And in 1964, the main character is Rozeena, and she and her three childhood friends are in their 20s and they're on the precipice of adulthood. They're very close to each other, but they're also keeping secrets from each other, pretty big secrets.
Mm.
And that leads to the tragic events of a single night that changes their lives forever. And in the present day timeline, a much older Rozeena, she's 81, she gets a telephone call from someone she hasn't heard from in over 50 years. And this person asks for a favor that might just expose those secrets of the past and destroy everything Rozeena has tried so hard to protect. So it is a story about the ripple effects of trauma and also about love and how far you go to protect the ones you love.
Yeah. It is, yeah, as I said before, it is a really beautiful novel. And although obviously one timeline is the families that we meet in 1964 have been displaced due to the partition of India and the creation of Pakistan. And we see even like 20 years on what's been happening to these families as they've tried to build a new life in this new country at the time. And I really enjoyed reading that. I really enjoy stories around partition because I think that we're not taught enough about it at all publicly. There's nowhere near as much accessible information as there should be, although there has definitely been a shift in recent years. So for me, it was a very welcomed story.
It was funny that you say that because when I was meeting with my agent, who is probably your neighbor because he's in London, he said to me on Zoom, because this was the pandemic, that it's a partition story. And I was like, no, it's not a
Mm.
partition story. I said that to him and he leaned back and he was like, oh, it's not a partition story. He was right. And what I was trying to do was I wanted to create a story that was not set in the partition because I wanted to see 20 years ahead,
Mm.
how it impacted the lives of children. That's what I wanted to examine. And I wanted to create a story that is entertaining and just fun to read. You want to turn the page and discover the secrets and the revelations without making it feel like a history book, you
Yeah.
know? So
Yeah.
because I went into it like that, I felt, no, I'm not going to call this a partition story. But obviously, that was one of the goals to introduce Bant to most people who've never heard of it. But,
Yeah.
today, a fifth of the world's population lives in that region. Maybe it's a good idea to know it because the effects are in the politics of the region.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's been over 75 years, like over 75 years now since partition. And I think anybody that is through family or otherwise connected to that region is has a partition story in one way or another,
Mhm.
whether you were not actually displaced at
Mhm.
time of partition. I think
Mhm.
everybody has a partition story. And so it would feel like disingenuous to hide from that and run
Yeah.
away from it, especially if you're writing a novel that is set in 1964,
Yeah.
which is less than 20 years after partition. I think it wouldn't really make sense. But yeah, like because I have read quite a lot of partition literature, and fiction and nonfiction, and I love it all because it is so different, because it's such a big part of history and so many experiences. I think like everybody that was impacted, and we're talking millions of people, had a different experience and had nuanced lived experiences in other ways. So yeah, I love the fact that this story is out there. But you've spoken a little bit about your interest in friendships, like childhood friendships, and also displacement and partition. But where did this specific story start for you? Like, where did it come from?
So I was interested in knowing more about my parents' families and their experiences during partition. And growing up, I only heard one or two very easy to relate, comfortable stories about partition.
Mm.
Most of the family did not speak of it. And as a child, I think you just accept, oh, these are our stories and let's just move on. Maybe with age, I wanted to know more. And when I started asking questions, nobody wanted to talk to me. That they did not want to revisit that time. And so I quickly shifted to other sources of research, like we do newspaper archives and nonfiction books and works by historians, documentaries. There's quite a lot out there.
Yeah.
And as I was researching, I realized that there are oral histories being collected now. I think in the past maybe 15, 20 years, pe- people woke up and saw that the survivors were fewer every year. And so let's get their stories on record. And through those stories, I saw that many people had never spoken about it before being interviewed for those stories. So my family was not unique in that way at all. It was something that most people just avoided revisiting. And so that was comforting to know for me. And so that's where the idea of the story grew from. Of course, it is completely fiction. I always say that. And But the emotional truths are there, the feelings behind those very difficult life changes and
Mm.
losses. And I feel that this trauma can really not even be healed unless we speak about it.
Yeah.
That's just the first step. There's just saying, yes, it was traumatic.
Yeah.
People don't even say that much. Of course, one little story isn't going to go anywhere to fixing the problems of that region, but it's a first step, and it's an individual human step that we can perhaps take as a community and then build from there.
So there's a particular, I'm trying not to give away too many spoilers, but there's a particular part of the, how do I say this? Okay, so there's a particular part of Rozeena's family's experience where they lose her brother. That's a spoiler, but it's okay. They lose her brother. It's a very particular experience.
Yes.
Is that rooted in like a story you read of, or did you completely make it up?
I made that up. The way it
Interesting.
was, the way it
Mm,
happened, I made it up. It is not unusual at all that that would have happened in that city at that time and in that way,
mm,
because it does mention at one point how many lives were lost in that particular city, and then what the administration did to protect the people. So all of that is based on history. This was just a fictionalized version of one
mm.
situation. Yeah.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
I just thought it was you put forward the like the story of what happened. I thought in a very dignified and respectful way, even though you were talking about something so bloody and traumatic. And it doesn't surprise me that your parents and your family had never spoken about partition. I know also my family, they don't talk about anything traumatic at all, but generally there is so much silence, and I think like self-silencing about partition, because not just of what was done in terms of the fact that so many people were killed in such a violent way, but because it was like friends and people that had lived as brothers and sisters and neighbors that had almost overnight turned on each other. And I think that there's so many layers of that emotional trauma aside from the physical stuff, the things that actually happened as well, that really need unpacking, but it's very difficult to talk about. And you present that in the book as well, because we've got some characters that really struggle in talking about what happened. And it takes years, even throughout the novel, for some of the realities to come forward. What in particular about trauma and the experiences of trying to process and trying to deal with that were you most interested in exploring?
I think
Mm.
silence, because I feel that sometimes it just makes things seem better on the outside because you're going on with your life. There are all these successes that are visible and all these goals that have been achieved, and you just paint this beautiful picture of of a life well lived, but inside there's this rot, I feel, that
Mm.
can never really keep the person whole. There's this
Mm.
big vacant space inside because we haven't worked on it
Mm.
inside. And it comes out in the oddest ways, whether it's in how we deal with relationships or our careers or our physical health, right?
Mm.
I think there's enough documentation on that, that it does affect us physically for generations. It alters us. So I think it was the silence behind trauma that I wanted to shake up and say that it's okay. It, it is an ego thing also. It's like a sign of weakness in some cultures more than others. And if we talk about it, then maybe it's less shameful.
Mm. Yeah. And it's interesting because in your novel, you not only talk about specifically the trauma around partition, but our characters, our four best friends, endure something very traumatic. A really difficult and traumatic incident happens that they're all privy and witness to. And they deal with it by not speaking about it, which is like decades after partition. And it's only until, as you said, 50 years later, some of that stuff begins to unravel and come out. But they also just like falter to just silence. Just let's not talk about it. We can pretend it didn't happen, or we can just. I think there is definitely this idea that the more you talk about something, the more real it becomes, and you're forced to confront exactly what happened, and the fact that today you are probably not okay because of something that you went through in the past. But actually, like you've said, not confronting it is only like worsening the problem. And we know from so much research and otherwise that this is why trauma is intergenerational. It passes down when it's not, because it's not dealt with properly. And we can have children or grandchildren like 2 or 3 generations down that are experiencing things and feeling things and behaving in certain ways and not always understanding where that's coming from.
Yeah, that's remarkable research, I feel like. How frightening is that? But at least we know it happens, so we can now try to heal before it's passed down. Yeah.
Yeah. And so you tell the story of these 4 friends that have
Mm.
grown up together and they're living in Karachi.
Yeah.
And you deal with a lot of different themes. So obviously we've spoken about partition, but one that is prominent throughout the book is this issue of class. And we
Mhm.
see it a lot with this friendship between Haris and Rozeena. Haris is very well connected and he's lived and studied abroad, and Rozeena is struggling to make it through. She's working really hard as a doctor, but she doesn't have the right connections. And she knows that she needs to work in order to keep her new family home. And then we also see it with Alia in her sort of pursuit of marriage and issues around her father's job. And I just found it was a real interesting exploration of class. And I think when we think about class in Pakistan, I always find it really fascinating as well because it's such an interesting class structure. But what were you keen to really bring out about class, and also how that can affect friendships when you've got people of different classes living seemingly close together and interacting in the same world?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the class idea started from partition too, because even in my own family, I noticed that privilege changes your experience of being a refugee.
Hmm.
Even though over 15 million people were displaced, but each experience was very different.
Mm.
And privilege played a huge role in that, on how they crossed. Were they on foot? Were they in a boat? Were they in a plane? And when they
Mm.
got to the other side, what did they have, right?
Mm.
Did they just have what they were wearing? Did they have a home? Did they have the financial means? Did they have education? Started with right the beginning of the idea, privilege. And then I have lived in Karachi. I went to college there. I had a home there. I lived there as an adult for over a decade. So I am extremely familiar with the life there and the class system, which is unfortunate, of course. We would like everyone to have all their basic needs satisfied and everyone treating each other as equals. But that hardly happens anywhere in the world.
Mm.
In some places, it's more pronounced, but everywhere there is a certain amount of class system. I wanted to see how, as children, we don't notice these things. Because when I look back at my childhood, I didn't notice many things. We learn a lot of our faulty ideas, I would say, about where people belong and what their worth is. As children, these 4 friends didn't know any different. All they knew was they all live on the same street. And how did that even happen? Because in many countries and in many cities, this cannot really happen, that
Mm.
people of such different means live on that same little street. But what an unusual event this was, in which there is this cross migration, and a lot of people ended up inhabiting homes that were left abandoned by the people who migrated the other way, right? You get people living next to each other who don't know where they came from. They could have come from anywhere. And you don't know what their means are, but for some reason, this is the house that they have been allotted, right? Or they're renting it, or there's someone who's been living there beforehand. And it was such an unusual situation that I could actually have this be true and and then see how those children grow up, and when they start dealing with real life problems and feeling responsible for their own lives and other people's lives, how those tensions tug at them to make certain decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to talk a little bit about the character of Alia. So she's one of the she's not the main character, but she's one of the four friends. I was really interested in Alia because she is somebody that is struggling, but she's really keen to break out of this caste that she's been born into, or the circumstances that they found themselves in, I should rather say, because that's what it is her family, as with the Rozeenas, were refugees, and now they're trying to build their lives. But yeah, I just wondered if you could reflect a little bit on Alia and her desire to really move away from the sort of the class that she's found herself in.
Yeah, without giving away any spoilers,
Yeah.
I will try to do that. I did want to talk about marriage, and I didn't want it to be the main thing. It's part of life, and in that culture, and honestly, most cultures that I have interacted with, marriage seems to be a very common goal. And I wanted to examine how that goal comes about, you know, what the reason for that is. I always tell younger people these days, since I have lived longer than them, that please be intentional about your choices, about your partners, your marriage, whether or not you're going to have children. You be intentional about everything, because we tended to just do things because it was done. This is what happens. This is what you do. You go to school, you go to college, you get a job, you get married, and it just goes on and on. And with that cultural aspect of what will people say, or log kya kahenge, that it puts extra burden on these societal expectations. So Alia wanted something so desperately, like she felt this was her way to have a life. But was it really her
Mm.
belief? And how long did it take her to discover what she wanted versus what everyone else expected of her? And it was a great responsibility also put on her, right? Because it wasn't just for her, it was for lifting the entire family. I feel that it takes so much courage. This was the 60s, right? Even today, it takes so much courage to break out of that and say, but what do I need for
Yeah.
me? And it sounds so selfish, right? I think a lot of the characters in the book, I think all four friends, regardless of privilege here. So, this is one thing I wanted to shine a light on. Regardless of privilege and that class differences, they were all struggling with their individual goals and needs versus what was expected from them. And that's very common, I would say, and regardless of gender. So I didn't want to have the typical oppressed female character that tends to grow out of that part of the world in
Yeah.
literature. I wanted to show that it is something that every person has to deal with.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And yeah, absolutely. I think your characters are living in Karachi, but you really draw light on the things that are so almost like universal and so common, especially when you are in your 20s and you're thinking about the rest of your life and you're thinking about what you want to do next. That sort of that struggle. And I guess what the privilege does is it gives some people options to do certain things and it doesn't give it to others. Um,
Absolutely.
but the
Yeah.
struggle is there. The struggle, how do
Yeah.
I balance what I want
Mhm.
versus also a responsibility I may feel towards my family, but then also, as you said, the society element of log
Yeah,
kya kahenge, what are people
yeah.
going to say, which I think is one of the biggest ills of the world, because this isn't just a South Asian problem. This is
No.
everywhere to different extents and different degrees, and it like portrays itself in different ways and with different words, but it's always the expectation that society has. And I think especially on women, but in the book we see it with men as well. But you said that you didn't want to portray, a woman that was, I don't know, struck like disempowered and like some of the more stereotypical stories that
Mm,
we have seen come out from the region. And so you give us Rozeena, who is our protagonist
yes.
in the novel. And I think she's a wonderful character. And I love the fact that we got to see her so much older as well.
Mm.
Rozeena is a really strong willed character, very intelligent, but also very emotionally in tune and aware and very thoughtful. Where did the character of Rozeena come from?
Oh.
What inspired her?
Occupation wise, I would say that in those days, through my research, women who did have an occupation were often teachers or doctors.
Mm,
So I think in that way, it was a very realistic and believable thing for her to be doing, especially someone who can obviously study well, because that would be a prerequisite for that degree. And her character, I think, was born from my experience with my grandmother. I My grandmother was this formidable, stoic, really feminist woman, way before feminism was even a word. And
mm,
I lived with her alone in the house that my grandparents got at the time of partition, the house that
mm,
they moved into. And I went to college and I was the only one living with her when she was in her 80s. I think I became the favorite grandchild then.
mhm,
I wasn't always, I can be honest about it, but I'm pretty sure I then became the favorite grandchild because I lived with her. But she was so strong. The things that she had gone through in life are unimaginable. And to be so independent and to refuse to leave your home and to have your routine and to be in control and to make your decisions, I was like, where did she get this strength from?
mm,
And never complaining, never being the victim. It was just remarkable for me to see where she came from. She did not go to school, but she had tutors at home growing up. So
mm,
again, there was privilege. There was a significant amount of privilege in that. She became a widow very young, after partition. So huge struggles, but never mentioned, never spoken about, which would have been better though for her health wise, I think, if she had. But that is really the woman that I had in mind, someone who has the confidence and the strength to know what needs to be done and then just to do it. Yeah,
mm. Yeah, brilliant. Because
yeah,
I think I know so many women that embody those same values and those same characteristics, but often we don't see that same strength in media representations of Pakistani
yeah.
women. We just don't see it enough. And actually, we come from lines of incredible women that have done
Yes,
so much. And I think, regardless of whether or not we process it, we know fundamentally we're going to be okay, and we can do anything because we've seen our mothers and grandmothers and great grandmothers. We know what they've done, and if they can do it, they've shown us in many ways. They've shown us the way. Um,
absolutely. I feel that the stories of women are often left out
yeah,
in nonfiction, definitely, and even in fiction at
yeah,
times. So I wanted to center a story around a woman to
yeah.
know that, to show that they are often the backbone of the family's survival, even.
Mm, absolutely. And so Rosina is a doctor, and
Yeah.
one of the other things that you explore through Rosina's occupation is this mix in Pakistan of people turning to traditional herbal, non-scientific medicine and treatment and health. And sometimes it's mixed in with, there's like a religious element to it, but sometimes it's just about the herbal stuff. But you bring it forward. And to be honest, I think that might have been one of the first times I read it in a book about Pakistan. And I found it so interesting because I often have conversations with people about like Hakimi medicine and where do we draw the line and how do we get the balance right and how do we know that it's safe and all of these
Yeah.
sorts of things. But what made you decide to bring that element into the story?
I've always been intrigued by Hakimi medicine or
Mm.
homeopathic medicine.
Yeah.
And I know that the word is misused all the time and it gives false legitimacy. Quacks who offer this health care really cheaply to
Mm.
society that is not educated about where to go for proper health care. Even if it's available, they may not understand the differences, and it is a huge scam. I truly believe in homeopathy and alternative medicine. It's science based, it's studied intensely in Pakistan and around the world.
Yeah.
But then there are those who take advantage of that and put the label on their medicines, on their clinics, and people really suffer from that. They pay sometimes more out of pocket and get fake treatment.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I wanted to shine a light on that too.
Yeah.
And yeah.
It's really interesting because some, again, I guess this is about like having access to the right quality of healthcare because there are some Hakims operating in Pakistan who are qualified doctors and they're specializing in natural remedies and they've also got an Islamic education as well. And it's about finding that balance. But I think that finding the right person in that line of work is very difficult because you need to make sure that there is that right balance and that the almost like the knowledge and the scientific stuff is also just to protect yourself, I think. And I remember someone was telling me recently, and this was I think something probably about 30 odd years ago now. She went to see a Hakim type person. I don't know if it was, I don't know how they had labeled themselves, but and this was an issue around trying to get pregnant and fertility and whatnot. And they had told her like, okay, you need to go home and you need to have a bath,
Oh
but you
God.
need to use water from 7 different wells. And because at that time everything was water all from
Oh,
wells, and so she was just like, okay, and you need to have this bath it needs to be outside, but obviously protected, so it wasn't like
yes.
anything dodgy, but it was like it needs to be outside, something to do with fresh air. I don't know, but you need to have water from 7 different wells. So my friend, her mother-in-law, then went to 7 different houses. Was like, can you give me some water? Some water?
Oh,
And my friend was like, I'm going to go along with this because
yeah.
it's like it's just a bath. I know I'm not going to hurt myself, but I don't like this is just bizarre. Like I just don't
Yeah.
understand it.
They take advantage of people's desperation. That's what
Yeah,
they're
and
doing, right?
and in
Yeah.
the end, like thankfully, I think she did it once because I think the person had told her that, oh, you need to do it for like 14 days or something. And then I think on the second day, thankfully, like her mother-in-law was like, this is just ridiculous. Like,
Okay.
how is this going to help you? We're not going to do it. But
Yeah.
it also takes, I think, it takes courage for people who come from a community where these sorts of things are revered and they are
Yeah.
believed for you to turn around and say, hold on a second, I think I'm going to call that out. I think that's rubbish. This person's taking advantage of us because they're telling
Yeah.
us to do something far fetched that's
Mhm.
not going to make a difference to us.
Mhm.
So then after 2 weeks, we're going to go back and we're going to
Yeah.
ask for something else. And they're going to say,
Yeah.
oh, it didn't work because of X, Y, and Z thing.
Yeah.
Take more money.
Yeah.
And it's just a never ending cycle. And you're right. Like it plays on people's vulnerabilities
Yeah.
and concerns and yearning, but also sometimes it's just the sheer knowledge that like this person probably can't afford to go to a fertility specialists in the city will step in. And I just think it's really sad because this is not, this happens all around the world. And when you are in that kind of situation, I think you get to the point where you're just like, I would do anything for this thing. I
Yeah,
would do anything to get pregnant. I would do
of
anything to
course.
heal from this illness, whatever it is.
Yeah,
And it's really sad that it gets taken advantage of. And actually, in your book, you show us how dangerous it can be,
yeah.
how wrong it can go if you don't really know what you're doing. So I thought it was just a really interesting thing that you decided to explore.
Yeah. I find it fascinating. And these days, even in like Costco, which is our big warehouse shopping center
Yeah.
here. I don't know if you have it in the
We have a
UK.
Costco. Yeah,
Oh,
we have.
okay. Sorry about that. Yeah.
No, it's fine.
You can get turmeric tablets
Yeah.
and things that I have been familiar with and using in different forms for many years. And now suddenly it's common knowledge. So there is definitely something to herbal treatments, right? I believe
Yeah.
in them. Aspirin has a base in I think some plant or something. So the science is there, but it's not to be misused and
Yeah.
certainly not to take advantage of people.
Yeah,
That's,
exactly,
yeah,
definitely.
yeah,
And so we have a dual timeline. So we
yeah,
have a modern day story with a much older Rozeena
yeah,
and also an older Haris who pops
yeah.
in. And Rozeena meets a young girl who's like a teenager who
Mm.
ends up spending a lot of time with her. I really loved that because I thought it was so interesting to see the interaction between the two of them and how it encouraged Rozeena to open up a little bit, even though she was quite reluctant. Yeah, I'm just really fascinated in why you decided to use this young girl as
Oh,
part
well,
of the story and what you were hoping to bring out.
yeah. Thank you for saying that you loved it. That makes me very happy. And I love the idea of intergenerational friendships.
Yeah,
And I think that they are not valued enough.
yeah,
Often they can be discouraged even. And I feel that in the book, both age groups, and this was like a grandmother, granddaughter, they weren't related, but that would be the ages of 81 and 15, right? And both people can learn from each other. It isn't necessary that learning only goes one way, right? And they were both catalysts of change for each other.
yeah,
And I think it's beautiful and it's true. It happens if we just let it happen and encourage it even more. There is so much that both parties can benefit from in knowing each other and just building a friendship, right?
mm,
It's just a friendship. It's they're not related. There's nothing transactional, but it because of the friendship, they both grow, learn, and benefit. And
yeah, absolutely. I
yeah,
think that, yeah, I really love grandparent, grandchild stories. And I think part of that is because I lost my grandfather when I was like 5 or 6, my
yeah,
maternal grandfather, so my nana. I never knew my paternal grandfather. He passed away when my father was really young, and my dadi, she
yeah,
lived in Pakistan, so hardly saw her. So I don't
mm,
I never had very strong relationships with my grandparents.
mhm,
And I really, if I think about if there's anything I feel missing, I think it is that. I feel really sad when I think about it, when I think, especially now because I have so many questions
yeah,
about what happened, but also I really wonder what they must be thinking about the world and what they must be
true,
thinking about me. And I can't, I don't have
yeah.
anywhere to take those. And there is a real, for me, like a real sense of loss. And I think that is quite a common experience.
Oh,
Um,
definitely. I agree. I think that there's a huge loss not knowing
yeah.
one's grandparents. In the book, I think that grandparents treat other young people differently than they would
Mm,
their own grandchildren. Oh, it's that thing how a mother and an aunt treats the child. It's the
yeah,
aunt is going to be the favorite. There's no
yeah,
question because she's not the mother.
definitely.
So I feel like there was this distance between Rosina and Zara because they were not related and they were strangers. And how they
Yeah.
interacted, who knows? I don't know if Rosina would have acted the same way with her own granddaughter. I don't know.
Yeah, we saw that Zara wasn't didn't see
At-
that sort of attention and the opening up from her own grandfather, right? Which is
that's
what
right.
which is what she communicates, and she picks up on all the
Yeah.
sets and the hidden truths and all of that, which is great. But I think it was really nice to see, even though like we don't see Zara a huge amount in the novel, but it was really interesting to see how she had changed throughout her interactions with Rozeena. And not she was gardening, and I think there is something really powerful about doing something physically with your hands and creating something,
Yeah.
but also just the chats that she was
Yeah.
getting.
Yeah.
It's and I think as well, when you're a teenager and you're grappling also with your identity of knowing that you're Pakistani but you're living
Yeah.
abroad, there's always
Yeah.
that struggle in
Yes.
understanding really who you are. And we see her see Karachi a little bit as
Yeah.
well, and that's really nice. And on Karachi, actually, so the novel is set in Karachi, and I have visited a couple of times. It's such a bustling city.
It
What were you really interested in showing people about Karachi?
Yes, I very immersive.
Mm.
I wanted the reader to feel that they were right there. And I hope that happened. I hope I conveyed that. But I also wanted it to be a Karachi, which is not the headlines in a
Mm.
newspaper. So many bombs went off, so many people are rioting or this. I didn't want any of that because it
Yeah.
is a city today of 24 million people. It's not even a city. I think it's a little country in
Yeah.
itself. And it is so ethnically diverse
Mm.
with people from all the provinces. And it's just so different in the way it's made up of people and the size of it. And therefore, one headline in one newspaper doesn't define the entire city.
No way.
And I
Yeah.
wanted to present this part of everyday life there, in which people are living and going on with their lives and having joyous moments and sad moments. And it's just life. And using Zara as a character who sees it from the outside, I felt would make it more relatable
Mm.
to readers who have never been there.
Yeah.
And also to show the evolution of the city from the 60s and
Mm.
then this giant population growth to today, and what happens to infrastructure. And maybe there's a reason that it's not enough because the
Mm.
population growth. And of course, we see that from Horace's point of view also, because he left at some point
Yeah.
and then went back to Karachi in the present day, and he sees it too. So I wanted to show it without telling, and that's what I wanted to present because I have great love for Karachi. It was my home growing up. That was my permanent, how we have a permanent address. My permanent address, even though I got no mail there, but in my heart, that was my permanent address. And then I lived there as an adult. I met my husband there. So I have a lot of affection and connection. Every year when my children were young and in my control, I would take them back for the entire summers to Karachi and to Lahore because that's where their other grandparents are.
Oh,
So I wanted to give them that same feeling, even though they haven't been moving around as much as I had as a child. So they didn't need it in that way. But I wanted them to feel it was normal. I wanted to normalize Karachi for them, even though it's wildly different from here. But I wanted them to feel that's normal and this is normal and it's just different. And we're
yeah.
all the same.
Yeah.
Now, I do consider, people ask me, what do you consider home now? I do consider Minnesota home now. It is officially the place I have lived longest in my life. Honestly, if we leave here at some point and go live somewhere else, that will be home. I feel I'm just very adaptable that way. As long as the people are around me or easily accessible, the actual constructed house or location is secondary to me. The people are what matter. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's really nice, and I really enjoyed just listening to you speak about Karachi because I lived for 2 years. I lived in Islamabad,
Oh,
and I had friends in Islamabad who told me that when you go to Karachi, they were like, it's just different. And I was like, what do you mean? Because I'd been to Lahore, and although
mm,
Lahore is like historic because of all the
right.
history,
Yeah.
it feels different to Islamabad. But I didn't feel like I didn't feel that the vibe was that different, or the people were very different. I just felt like it was a different place, and obviously it's a different city. But they were like, no, but Karachi is very different. And I was like, okay. And I didn't end up going until a few years later. And I went for some work, actually, and I've been a couple of times now. And it is just very different. It's very different. It feels, I don't know if this is your experience of it, but it feels almost less judgmental of a city.
Yeah.
It feels a lot more open. It feels a bit more welcoming. And it doesn't feel as cliquey. Islamabad is very cliquey, but
Oh,
Karachi just feels very different.
I
Maybe
could
because it's
not have
different.
said this better than you. And I would, if I said all of that, it would be like, oh, she's showing off about Karachi. But it is true because it is such a cosmopolitan city. And as
Yeah,
I said, people from everywhere are there. Um, and you don't even know where they're from. And
yeah,
honestly, nobody cares. That's the
yeah,
thing.
yeah,
Nobody cares. You do you. You find your type of people. There, it is not cliquey. It is very tolerant of everything. At times, if I visit in the winter, I will just wear jeans and a top and walk around. You can do that without anyone saying. It's very
yeah,
hard to do that, even in Lahore for me. I feel
yeah.
like there's a certain way we need to behave there, and someone might get a call and say, "Look who we found walking around in jeans." I doubt that would happen, but it's just how I feel the difference. And it does come from the size of the city
Yeah,
and from the makeup of all these different types of people. So everyone is from someplace else
yeah,
practically, and majority, I'm sure, the number in numbers. And therefore, you never feel like you don't belong.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I hope more people get to visit Karachi. And you're right, like it has a really bad rep, but it is a great city. I have absolutely loved speaking to you, Nigar.
Oh,
Thank you so much for your time. And just as we wrap up, actually, what do you really hope for anyone that picks up your novel?
first of all, I just want them to be entertained. I
Yeah,
want them to really feel for the characters and just want to turn the page and find out what's going to happen next. What is the secret and what's going to happen when everyone knows about it? So, entertainment, number one. And secondly, I would love for them to just realize that we are people. The whole world is the same in terms of human beings. And it we go through the same emotions and the same life goals and fears just like anyone else.
mm,
So, this is just one story. It doesn't represent the entire South Asian
of
experience, of
course. Yeah.
course. But one by one, these stories will hopefully humanize everybody across the world.
Yeah.
And that's what I hope they get from this.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
did say that was going to be the last question, but I have my
Yeah.
very last one, which I hope
Yeah.
also will not be too long. The title of the book is Under the
Yeah.
Tamarind Tree,
Yeah.
which makes sense when we understand the tamarind tree and then what happens.
Mm.
But why did you decide to focus on a tamarind tree? Like, why not an apple tree or a mango
Ah.
tree or something else? What is it about tamarind?
Tamarind trees are indigenous to Karachi.
Mm.
And my grandmother's house had this huge one in the back, this giant one, an old one. And her cook used to take the pods off,
Yeah.
the ripe pods, and then make tamarind chutney on the
That's-
like the silbatta, which is like this rock and grinder, if you want to call it that.
yeah.
And
That's it.
sorry,
A grinder and a sieve. That's what the debate
yes.
does. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I was very familiar with the tree, of course, and I felt that it did symbolize the city, how so many trees have been cut down because of the population growth and construction, how it provided sustenance of fruit. Um, and, to be honest, I submitted this very incomplete. It was just about 50, 60 pages for a mentorship program with an agency, the Madeline Milburn Agency in London. And it was a very unique opportunity to submit an incomplete manuscript because that never happens. No agency wants an incomplete manuscript. But I did it and I was very lucky to be selected. And then I got representation from the agency. And when my agent, Giles, he read the first few chapters that I had submitted and, and liked them, and then we had our first call, I had submitted it with the title The House with the Tamarind Tree. And it
Mm.
was just like the weekend before the deadline. I said, oh, these pages need a title. So let me just give it this title. And I submitted it. And on our first call, Giles said to me, great, I'm so excited to work with you, etc. There is no like tamarind tree in your pages. And I said, oh, yeah. So it was in my head. Apparently, that's how I write. I leave things in my head, and I knew it was going to be there in some way or form. And throughout the novel, I wanted its presence because I just felt like it was so representative of the city. But I had left it in my brain. And then, obviously, through drafts and revisions and everything, it came out. And then when the book got purchased by Penguin, we had the discussion with the editor about titles, and then
Mm.
we kept the tamarind tree part and then just changed it to condense it. And
Yeah.
she said she was really smart about it. She said that it would add a little bit of the suspense factor
Yeah.
by making
Yeah.
it under the tamarind tree. And I was like,
It
that's
does
right.
definitely.
Yeah.
Oh, that's so
Yeah.
lovely. Thank you so much for sharing that. And thank you so much for your time today. It's been so lovely speaking to you, Nigar.
Thank you so much, Samia, for having me. Thanks.
If you enjoyed this episode, I'd really appreciate it if you could like, follow, subscribe on your podcast platform of choice, and also connect with me on social media. It would mean so much if you could rate and leave a review, as it helps more people find the show.